If you're relatively new to miter saws and table saws, you know that finding the right blade for your project can be somewhat intimidating. Perhaps you've gone to one of the big box stores and walked over to the saw blade display, only to be totally confused by all the different types of blades. There are dozens of blade manufacturers and even a greater number of blade types if we take into account the consideration of all the possible blade properties such as kerf, tooth count, tooth geometry, etc. So in the interest of time and ease of understanding, I'm going to narrow this down to the most common blade types that might be used in woodworking. Perhaps the first thing to look at when selecting a blade for your project is tooth count. Here we see 4 blades with 24, 40, 50, and 80 tooth counts. As you can see, there is a significant difference in the spacing of the teeth between these blades. The 24 has the widest spacing. Next is the 40 tooth blade with a tighter spacing, and then the 50 is even closer. And finally, the 80 tooth blade having the closest spacing of all 4 blades. As you can see, this is a 24 tooth multi-purpose blade like the one I used to build my potting bench. You'll also find this blade comes as a standard with many new table saws. This can be used for cross cuts as well as rib cuts where you know you can handle any fraying or splintering that might occur with a sander. This blade will allow you to cut faster as it removes more material with each pass. You can get clean cuts with this blade on certain types of harder wood, but if you're making furniture or nice shelving, you might want to consider a higher tooth count. You'll also notice that this is a thin kerf blade, which means the blade itself is thinner, making your cuts thinner, as well as going much faster. Looking at the 40 tooth blade again, you'll notice the teeth are closer together than on the 24 tooth blade. This blade is good for both cross cuts as well as rib cuts and should result in edges with somewhat less splintering or fraying as you might expect from a 24 tooth blade. However, if you're looking for really clean edges, you will either have to do some sanding or move up to a higher tooth count blade such as a 60 or an 80. This can be a good multi-purpose blade to have in your shop along with all the others. Because of the tooth count and tooth geometry of this 50 tooth blade, it is designed to provide cleaner cuts with little or no sanding depending on the material you are cutting. This particular make has what the manufacturer is calling oversized teeth, which allows for sharpening once the blade becomes dull. This feature is nice to have, as sharpening a blade can be far less expensive than replacing one. If your project is large, involving pressure treat or hardwoods, this type of blade might be one for you to consider. Miter saws are commonly used for cutting molding, which requires clean cuts for tight corner joints. For this reason, many miter saw manufacturers ship them with 60 tooth blades. If used correctly, these blades produce cuts that require little or no sanding, depending on the materials being cut. Because these blades do not remove as much material with each rotation as perhaps a 24 tooth blade might, they are not commonly used for long rib cuts on sheets of plywood. If your project involves fine woodworking, such as nice furniture, display shelving in a living area, or kitchen or bath cabinetry, you will certainly want to have an 80 tooth blade for your saw. This blade will provide exceptionally clean cuts, which will rarely require any sanding. Just like the 60 tooth blade, it can be used for cross cuts. However, this is not the type of blade you will typically want to use to rip cut sheets of plywood unless you really need clean edges. Perhaps the 2 most important things to keep in mind when selecting the right blade for your project are the type of wood you'll be cutting and how clean and accurate your cuts will need to be. I recently built a potting bench out of pressure-treated wood to be placed on our back porch. All of the cuts were cross cuts, and while I like to be accurate, I could be off in some places and no one would know the difference except me. Since this bench was outside and unpainted, I was not concerned about the finish of the cuts, meaning that if there was some fraying or splintering, I would just sand it down with some 80 grit, which I did. For this project, I used a 24 tooth multi-purpose blade that was already on my miter from an earlier project, so this segment of video will give you an idea of what that type of cut looks like on pressure-treated wood. This is a cut I made with a 36 tooth blade on my table saw. As you can see, there are some tool marks from the blade, as well as from the amount of control I was applying to the workpiece as I fed it into the blade. If I had applied better control, I suspect the finish on this cut would have been much better. This is a cut I made with my miter saw using a 60 tooth blade instead of a 36 tooth blade on a piece of MDF. As you can see, there are less tool marks on this piece due to the type of blade that I used for this cut. I hope this video has taken some of the mystery out of the basic types of blades that are available for your woodworking projects. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. If you found this video useful, please press like and be sure to share with your friends. If you're not already a subscriber, I would love to have you as a subscriber. And as always, good luck on your projects.